They say he came down the old gravel road every Thursday. Boots thick with dust, hat tilted low, and a pie tin swinging from one calloused hand. Old Mr. Henry. Most just called him the Dinner Whisperer. Nobody really knew where he came from, but everyone in town swore he carried the lost recipes of the land, meals that only lived in root cellars in memory. The kind of dishes that could bring a man to tears or make a child sit still in silence, fork in hand, reverent. Some say he once traded a full belly of ham hocks and greens for a broken-down horse. Others remember how he made peach dumplings from nothing but Jared's syrup and dry biscuits after a storm took out the pantry. And if you were lucky enough to sit at his table, you didn't ask questions. You just ate and you remembered. He never wrote a recipe down. But word passed on through field hands and fence talk. Whispers from grannies and rusted-out recipe boxes tucked behind jars of preserved beans. Now, I can't promise these next 15 farmer dinners are exactly like Henry made them, but they're close. Real close. So grab your fork and hold on tight, because we're about to dust off the second half of the forgotten cookbook. These dishes weren't made for looks. They were made for hunger, hope, and holding on. Let's get back to the table where thrift met tradition, and every bite told a story. Coming up next, potato and egg gratin with onion butter, and beyond. There was a time when farm kitchens could turn a handful of humble ingredients into a meal fit for the end of a long workday. Potato and egg gratin with onion butter wasn't extravagant, but it was honest food that did the job and warmed the soul. The dish began with thinly sliced potatoes, laid down in a battered baking dish that had probably seen more meals than guests. Between the layers went sautéed onions, slow-cooked in farm-churned butter until golden and soft, their sweetness mellowed by time and heat. Some farm cooks called this onion butter, and it was a trick passed down in whispers, a way to stretch flavor without reaching for expensive ingredients. Over that went a mixture of beaten eggs, sometimes thinned with milk or cream if it was available. The eggs soaked into the potato layers, binding everything together into something that was both casserole and custard. When baked, the top turned golden and just a bit crisp, while the inside stayed soft and rich, holding the flavor of each simple ingredient. Sometimes a farmer's wife might crack a few whole eggs on top right before baking, letting them set like little islands on the creamy surface. If there was cheese, it might make an appearance, but most often, it was just salt, pepper, and the kind of flavor that only comes from slow cooking and smart choices. This was the kind of dish that filled bellies without draining the pantry. It was meatless but satisfying, modest but full of love. And when it hit the table on a cold night, it didn't need an introduction, just a spoon, and silence, as everyone dug in. Potato and egg gratin reminded farm families that simple food could still be good food, and sometimes, the quietest meals speak the loudest. Back when white sugar was too dear for everyday folk, farmers turned to sorghum syrup, thick, dark, and honest, the kind of sweet you could taste even after the plate was empty. And when pork chops hit the cast iron, sorghum turned supper into something close to sacred. This dish didn't come from cookbooks. It came from memory, passed down like a well-worn quilt or a pocket knife your father gave you. Pork chops, often from the shoulder or rib, were seared in a smoking skillet with just a flick of lard or bacon fat. You'd hear the sizzle before you smelled the sweetness. Then came the glaze. A spoonful of sorghum stirred with a splash of vinegar, sometimes cider, sometimes white, depending on what was on hand. It was brushed over the chops just before they finished cooking, bubbling and sticking like caramel against the brown meat. The edges went dark, nearly black, but never bitter. And just when the glaze reached its shine, you'd throw in sliced apples, firm ones like Winesap or Granny Smith, right into the same pan. They'd soak up the glaze, soften at the edges, and sweeten the whole house with the smell of fall. This wasn't Sunday roast. It was Tuesday night triumph. It was the smell of the screen door slamming and a hungry family gathering fast. Served with grits or spoon bread, maybe even mashed sweet potatoes, it didn't need dressing up. Sorghum-glazed pork chops weren't just about flavor. They were about resourcefulness. About finding richness and simplicity and turning lean days into something worth remembering. And if you grew up eating them, you'll never forget the way that sticky sweet glaze clung to your fingers and your heart. There was a time when no cut was wasted, not even the oxtail. On the farm, that bony, overlooked piece was gold to those who knew how to coax out its hidden richness. And when wrapped in flaky crust with slow-cooked vegetables, it became the centerpiece of a dinner you didn't dare interrupt with small talk. Baked oxtail pie wasn't fast food, it was patience made edible. First, the oxtail was browned deeply, each piece kissed by the skillet until its fat rendered and flavor bloomed. Then it was simmered for hours with root vegetables, carrots, turnips, onions, until everything softened and the meat practically melted off the bone. That long braise transformed scraps into something close to sacred, a dark, velvety stew that could quiet even the noisiest kitchen. The crust? It wasn't fancy. Just flour, water, and lard worked together by hand. Some folks used butter when they could, but most relied on what was available. The filling was poured in, piping hot and thick with promise, and covered with a second crust, crimped at the edges like a seal on a letter home. When it baked, the top turned golden and flaky while the inside bubbled with soul. The smell wrapped the house like wool, a mix of savory meat and sweet vegetables, calling every hungry hand to the table. And when it was sliced open, steam would rise like an invitation. You didn't serve this in a hurry. You sliced it carefully, respectfully. Each piece held stories, of long winters, of empty cupboards made full by ingenuity, of families stretched but not broken. Baked oxtail pie wasn't a recipe, it was a ritual. And in kitchens that knew how to make do, it stood as proof that the best meals don't come from abundance, they come from knowing how to turn very little into something unforgettable. You ever hear beans whisper? Out on the range or in a quiet farmhouse kitchen, they did. Not literally, of course, but with every slow bubble and gentle stir, they told stories of hard roads, tired muscles, and meals that had to matter. Cowboy beans with fatback and dried chilies weren't invented in some test kitchen. They were born by firelight and forged in cast iron. Pinto beans were the usual pick, cheap, hearty, and capable of soaking up everything they were given. They'd be left to sit in cold water overnight, waking up swollen and ready for the long cook ahead. The fatback was the secret, just a chunk of salty cured pork, tossed in early to melt down and release that smoky, salty richness that flavored the whole pot. Then came the dried chilies, not too many, not too bold. Just enough to warm the tongue and wake the spirit. Some cooks threw in garlic. Others a chopped onion. A few added a splash of coffee if the pot got too tame. But the real magic? Time. You didn't rush cowboy beans. The longer they cooked, the deeper they got. By evening, they weren't just beans, they were supper, soul, and story in one. Back in the day, these beans traveled from cattle drives to farmhouse tables, becoming a staple in western and southwestern kitchens. They showed up with cornbread, tortillas, or just a spoon if that's all you had. On cold nights, a bowl of cowboy beans wrapped around you like a second coat, hot, filling, familiar. No fluff, no garnish, no fuss. Just food that knew where it came from and who it was meant for. Cowboy beans weren't fancy. But they never needed to be. Because when you've got flavor built from patience and purpose, you've already got more than enough. They say you can tell a lot about a home by the way it smells at supper. And in the heartland, nothing said home louder than a sheet pan of meatloaf sizzling in the oven, its crust bubbling golden, sweet, and just slightly crisp. But this wasn't your diner's meatloaf. No breadcrumbs. No store-bought glaze. This was farmstead meatloaf with a cornflake crust, humble, clever, and absolutely unforgettable. It started with whatever meat you had, ground beef, pork scraps, maybe even venison if it was a good hunting year. Mixed with chopped onions, a cracked egg, and a bit of milk. But the real star? Crushed cornflakes. Cheap, crunchy, and always somewhere in the pantry. They stretched the meat further than anyone expected and gave the top a toasty sweetness that no breadcrumb ever could. It wasn't molded into a loaf pan. This meatloaf got pressed onto a baking sheet, flattened slightly, then baked wide so the edges caramelized just right. The result? More crust for everyone. And on a busy farm table, that's what folks fought over. You'd find this dish at church suppers, school fundraisers, and on a Tuesday night when money was tight but spirits were strong. Some families topped it with ketchup before baking. Others swore by plain. But no matter the twist, it always smelled like comfort and tasted like belonging. Cornflakes weren't just for breakfast back then. They were survival disguised as sweetness. And in meatloaf, they worked overtime, adding texture, flavor, and just a touch of charm. Farmstead meatloaf didn't try to impress. It just showed up, hot and ready, when you needed it most. And sometimes, that's the most beautiful kind of meal there is. The story goes that a farmer once fed a whole crew of field hands with nothing more than cornmeal, onions, and a few slices of bacon. No one believed him until they tasted the Johnny cakes. These weren't your average pancakes. Onion and bacon Johnny cakes were skillet-born magic, crispy at the edges, tender in the middle, and bursting with flavor no one saw coming. It began with a simple cornmeal batter, stone ground if you were lucky, mixed with buttermilk or water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a touch of baking soda. But the real trick was in what you folded in slow-cooked golden onions and bits of crisp bacon. The onions were often fried in the leftover bacon drippings, which added a smoky sweetness that made every bite feel richer than it had any right to. Ladled onto a hot skillet, each Johnny cake sizzled and popped, browning into golden discs that were equal parts pancake, bread, and memory. You could serve them up with syrup if you had it, greens if they were fresh, or just a pat of butter if times were lean. And they worked for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. That's what made them so special. They belonged wherever they were needed. Back then, flour could run out. Yeast could spoil. But cornmeal? It was the soul of the farm pantry. And these Johnny cakes were proof that something so modest could become unforgettable with just a little help from the smokehouse and the garden. Families didn't make a big fuss about these meals. They just made them, over and over, because they worked. Onion and bacon Johnny cakes were more than food. They were fuel. For tired hands, hopeful hearts, and homes where every crumb mattered. They say a good farm cook could make a meal out of nothing. And this dish, creamed celery and potatoes, might just be the best proof of that. Picture this, a late autumn afternoon. The frost is creeping in. The pantry's mostly empty, but there's still a bin of potatoes and a row of celery stalks out back, the last of the harvest. It wasn't a time for luxury, it was a time for knowing what to do with what was left. So you peeled the potatoes and chopped the celery, tossed them both into a big pot, and boiled them until they were soft enough to mash with a fork. Then came the magic, the cream sauce. A bit of flour, a slab of butter, and milk if you had it. The sauce got whisked together over heat until it turned smooth and velvety, then poured right over the veggies like it was something grand. If you were lucky, you might add a pinch of cheese on top, maybe even breadcrumbs. But even plain, it was rich, soothing, and satisfying. Served with hot biscuits or toasted bread, this dish filled bellies and warmed bones. Most folks didn't talk about creamed celery and potatoes. It wasn't the Sunday roast or a special holiday pie. But it was the kind of meal that showed up when you needed comfort the most. When there was work to do, money was tight, and supper needed to happen without a single trip to town. And the best part? The flavor. Bright, slightly peppery celery mixing with the soft, starchy potatoes, all wrapped in that creamy blanket. It reminded people that food didn't need to be complicated to be good, it just needed heart. For many farm families, this wasn't just a dish, it was a memory. One bite, and the whole kitchen came back to life. They used to say, "Don't throw away what still has a job to do." That's how pickle brine pork shoulder roast earned its place on the farmhouse table. See, back in the day, there was no such thing as waste, not on a working farm. Every jar, every scrap, every drop was kept, counted, and reused. When the last pickle was plucked from the jar, the brine wasn't dumped. No sir, it was liquid gold. And if you had a pork shoulder waiting in the icebox, you knew just what came next. That pork shoulder got bathed in the leftover brine overnight, garlic cloves, peppercorns, mustard seeds, dill, every little flavor in that cloudy green liquid soaked straight into the meat. Come morning, it was patted dry and laid into a roasting pan. No fancy rubs, no expensive glazes. Just faith in what your kitchen already had. It roasted slow. The fat crisped up. The scent sharp, rich, savory, wrapped around the house like smoke curling from a chimney. And when it hit the table, steaming and glistening with a hint of vinegar tang, it didn't need a thing more. Some folks would toss carrots or potatoes right into the roasting pan, letting them soak up the pork drippings and brine. Others kept it simple, sliced thick on a plate with a hunk of bread and a few garden pickles on the side. It wasn't just a meal. It was a lesson passed down in quiet kitchens, that the last of something could be the start of something better. Today, chefs talk about nose-to-tail and zero waste like it's a new trend. But farmhouse cooks were doing it long before it had a name. And pickle brine pork shoulder roast? That was one of their proudest tricks. They said if you could smell smoked jowls simmering with greens, you were close to home. And if the dumplings hit the pot? Dinner was about to change your whole day. Turnip greens with smoked jowl and corn dumplings wasn't just food, it was comfort that rolled in slow, like fog across a winter field. Back when folks still pulled their dinner from the dirt and didn't flinch at a little fat, this dish meant the day's work was finally done. The smoked jowl, a fatty cut from the hog's cheek, was rich, deep, and salty. A little went a long way. You'd drop it into a pot of water, maybe with an onion or two, and let it simmer until the house filled with the scent of something good and slow. Next came the greens. Turnip greens, fresh from the garden or the market, cleaned and chopped and added to the pot. They'd wilt into the broth, turning silky and dark, soaking up every bit of smoky flavor the jowl gave off. And just when the whole thing looked ready, in went the corn dumplings. Cornmeal, salt, a touch of baking powder, and just enough milk to form a thick batter. You'd drop spoonfuls right into the simmering pot. They'd puff up like little clouds, soft on the inside, soaked in broth and bold with flavor. This was one of those meals that didn't need a meatloaf or a roast beside it. It stood alone, proud, hearty, humble. You'd eat it from a deep bowl with a chunk of cornbread, and if you were lucky, some pepper vinegar drizzled over the top. Farmhouse cooking wasn't about showing off. It was about survival, soul, and satisfaction. And nothing said that better than a pot full of greens, smoke, and dumplings that filled your belly and hugged your spirit. You didn't need a clock to know it was morning, just the smell of sausage hitting a cast iron pan and biscuits rising in the oven. That was the alarm clock on the farm, and nobody ever hit snooze. Homemade sausage cakes with sorghum biscuits was how many farming families started their day when work began before the sun did. There was no store-bought sausage involved, this was meat ground by hand, seasoned from memory, and cooked with the kind of care you don't see in breakfast anymore. Ground pork was mixed with salt, black pepper, crushed red pepper if you had it, and a touch of sage. Shaped into thick, uneven patties and laid gently into a hot skillet, usually already seasoned with decades of cooking. As the cakes browned, the edges crisped, the fat sizzled, and the aroma drifted down hallways and across porches. Then came the biscuits. But not just any biscuits, these were sweetened with sorghum syrup, that thick, dark, golden brown molasses cousin that farmers prized before refined sugar took over the shelves. Sometimes it was drizzled over the top. Other times, it was stirred straight into the dough, giving the biscuits a rich, earthy sweetness that cut through the salt of the sausage like a dream. Stack them together, sausage and biscuit, and you had a sandwich that could power a man through an entire day of hauling hay, fixing fences, or harvesting field corn. These weren't dishes you found in cookbooks. They were passed from hands to mouths, from grandmothers to grandsons, written in pencil and memory. Meals like this weren't fast, but they were full of flavor, full of meaning, full of the kind of care that today feels like a relic. You didn't eat sausage and sorghum biscuits to be fancy. You ate them to feel whole. You didn't buy duck, you earned it. Out on the farm, if you wanted duck for dinner, it meant waking up before dawn, loading your shotgun, and heading down to the creek or marsh in the cold fog of autumn. And if you were lucky, and the sky gave you one good shot, the duck might just end up in a stew pot by sundown. Duck and onion stew with a vinegar splash wasn't fancy, but to a farm family, it was a feast. After plucking and cleaning, you'd sear the duck in a deep iron pot, skin side down, until it gave up its fat and brown like wild meat should. Then came the onions, lots of onions, sliced thick and added into bathe in the duck fat until they turned soft and golden. Next came the liquid water if that's all you had, or maybe broth from yesterday's bones. But the real magic? A good splash of vinegar. Apple cider vinegar was preferred, but even white would do. That vinegar didn't just brighten the broth, it cut through the richness of the duck, balancing it like a forgotten art form. The stew simmered for hours. The duck fell off the bone, the onions melted into the broth, and the whole thing took on a deep, soulful flavor that filled more than just the belly, it filled the household. This dish didn't need potatoes or dumplings to be complete. Just a piece of bread to soak up the juices, and silence around the table as everyone ate slowly, savoring what couldn't be rushed. It was food tied to the seasons, to skill, to the land. And in a time where nothing was certain, not weather, not harvest, not even meat on the table, duck stew was a victory. And every bite reminded you, you earned it. They say waste not, want not, but on the farm, that wasn't a saying. It was survival. At the end of summer, when the days were shortening and the nights carried a chill, there were always green tomatoes still clinging to the vine. No time left for them to ripen. But instead of tossing them, old farmers knew exactly what to do: make hash. Green tomato hash with potatoes and fat drippings was the quiet hero of the farmhouse kitchen. It never made the cover of any cookbook. But it made sure your stomach was full when the garden had given all it could. You'd start by chopping those stubborn green tomatoes, firm, tart, and defiant against the coming frost. Potatoes came next, cubed small so they'd crisp up fast. Then the skillet, cast iron, always, went on the stove with a generous dollop of leftover bacon grease or sausage drippings. That's where the magic began. The potatoes hit first, sizzling into golden brown perfection. Then the tomatoes, tossed in with a hiss, their tang slicing through the richness of the fat. You didn't stir too much, you wanted those crispy bits on the bottom. If you had an onion, you chopped it in. If there was a scrap of ham or corn in the fridge, in it went too. What you ended up with was something hearty, sharp, and satisfying. The tomatoes softened just enough, the potatoes held their bite, and every mouthful tasted like thrift, grit, and good sense. Some folks topped it with a fried egg. Others just scooped it into a bowl and dug in. It didn't matter. It was dinner. Or breakfast. Or lunch. That was the brilliance of green tomato hash: it didn't follow rules. It followed the land. And the land never let you down. In the quiet years between harvests and spring, when meat was scarce and the cellar shelves were running thin, farm families turned to the woods and to mushrooms. Baked mushrooms in cream and breadcrumbs wasn't a luxury. It was ingenuity. It was what you made when the hen stopped laying, the cow went dry, and you still needed to fill plates with something warm and nourishing. Back then, mushrooms weren't some exotic ingredient. They were part of life. Grown in damp barns or gathered wild by those who knew which ones wouldn't kill you. The button mushroom, the cremini, cheap, dependable, and earthy. Once you had a bowlful, the rest was simple. You'd slice the mushrooms thick, toss them in a buttered dish with a splash of milk or cream, whatever the cow gave that day. Onions, already softened in a skillet, added sweetness. A spoonful of flour thickened the mix, turning it into something between a casserole and a stew. But it was the topping that made it shine: a heavy layer of breadcrumbs, seasoned if you had time, plain if you didn't. They browned in the oven like a dream, forming a golden crust that crackled as your spoon broke through. This dish was deceptively rich. The cream and mushrooms mingled into a gravy so flavorful, you'd swear there was meat in there. It filled the house with a smell that brought people to the table without calling. Some added cheese if they could spare it. Others didn't need it. Served with boiled potatoes or a hunk of sourdough bread, it didn't need sides. It stood tall on its own, proof that protein doesn't always have to come from a butcher's hook. It was humble, yes. But it fed bellies and hearts alike. You didn't feel poor eating it. You felt clever. Full. And maybe that's the lesson baked into those old farmhouse recipes: you don't need more. You just need to know what to do with what you've got. No one ever mistook pinto bean loaf for steak. But back in the lean years, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the wartime rations, it didn't need to be. It wasn't pretending. It was holding its ground with pride. When meat was out of reach and beans were still cheap, this loaf became a kitchen miracle. Farmers knew how to stretch every bit of nutrition, and pinto beans, hearty, protein-rich, and easy to store, were gold in a sack. You'd boil them slow until soft, mash them like potatoes, and mix them with breadcrumbs, diced onions, maybe an egg or two if the hens were generous that day. But what really made the dish unforgettable was the glaze. A chili spice glaze, thick and sweet with just enough vinegar to bite back. Usually homemade from a spoonful of tomato paste or canned sauce, a dash of sugar, and dried spices that had lived in a tin on the shelf longer than anyone could remember. You'd brush it across the top of that humble loaf before sliding it into the oven. As it baked, the glaze caramelized into a glossy, sticky layer. The loaf crisped at the edges, staying moist in the middle, and it smelled like you'd made something special even if you hadn't spent more than $1. It sliced clean. It held up in a lunch pail. It even made for excellent sandwiches the next day with a slather of mustard or a cold slice of onion. Pinto bean loaf was more than survival. It was resilience on a plate. It proved you could create comfort, warmth, and flavor with almost nothing at all. It fed children, grandparents, field hands, and neighbors alike. No one went hungry when this was on the table. And honestly, even if you had the money for beef, you didn't always need it. Sometimes beans, a little spice, and a whole lot of care were more than enough. Some folks remember the smell of Sunday roast. Others? They remember boiled chicken with vinegar and dumplings, a dish that didn't wait for special occasions. It showed up when you needed it, when the week had been long, the skies gray, and the pantry shelves half empty. On the farm, chicken wasn't cut into neat supermarket pieces. You took the whole bird, sometimes young, sometimes tough and old, and boiled it with care. Not fried. Not roasted. Just boiled. And not in plain water, either. The secret was vinegar. Just enough to brighten, to balance the fat, and to make even the roughest cut feel sharp and awake. As the chicken simmered, its meat softened and slipped from the bone. That broth, cloudy, golden, touched with salt and black pepper, wasn't just liquid. It was life. Into it went dumplings, made from flour, salt, a little baking powder, and water or milk if you had it. Dough dropped by spoonfuls into the bubbling pot, where they puffed into soft, pillowy clouds. By the time supper rolled around, you had a pot full of tender chicken, vinegar-spiked broth, and dumplings soaked in flavor. It wasn't pretty, but it filled the house with steam, warmth, and the sound of spoons scraping the bottom of the pot. This meal didn't come from a cookbook. It came from necessity, from a mother's hands and a grandmother's voice. Passed down, adapted, and stretched. Sometimes it had herbs. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the bird was scrawny. Sometimes not. But always, it fed many with little. Boiled chicken with vinegar and dumplings didn't just nourish bodies. It taught lessons in thrift, patience, and gratitude. And like the best farmhouse recipes, it reminded every soul at the table that you didn't need more, just enough. Maybe you've never tasted boiled chicken with vinegar. Maybe hog maw sounds strange, or pinto bean loaf feels like a step too far. But that's exactly the point, isn't it? These weren't dishes made for spotlight or style. They were made in quiet kitchens, on cold mornings, late nights, and hard seasons. They were crafted from scraps and leftovers, made with calloused hands and patient hearts. Our grandparents, and their parents before them, didn't cook with measuring spoons or five-star dreams. They cooked with what they had. A jar of pickled brine. A handful of turnips. One small chicken to stretch across a family of 8. And in doing so, they created something beautiful. Honest. Unforgettable. These 30 forgotten farmer dinners aren't just recipes. They're stories. They're what happened when resourcefulness met resilience, when flavor was born from necessity, and when love sat steaming in a chipped bowl passed down the table. Today, we scroll through endless recipes on glowing screens. We order takeout in minutes. And yet, something feels missing. That slow simmer. That long wait. That deep, quiet satisfaction of making food that matters not just to the body, but to the soul. So maybe it's time we brought some of these back. Not just the dishes, but the mindset. The respect for every ingredient. The pride in simplicity. The joy of enough. Because tucked between those old cookbook pages and faded recipe cards is more than just food. There's a history. A legacy. And maybe, if we listen closely and cook with care, we'll hear those old farm kitchens whispering back. If this video stirred a memory or sparked an appetite for something real, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. We've got more flavors from the past waiting to be rediscovered.